Well, good morning. Nina Mane, in the language of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, where my home is. Good morning, hello, how are you? Uncle Ray, thank you very much for your welcome to the Eora Nation, and can I too acknowledge all of Australia's Indigenous peoples, but in doing so, particularly acknowledge as Education Minister how much we continue to learn of Indigenous culture and knowledge, from Indigenous culture and knowledge, and together as a nation to build upon Indigenous culture and knowledge. Lisa, thank you for your very warm, generous, almost over-the-top welcome. I hope I can live up to the challenges that you've set me there. Can I acknowledge Professor John Hattie, the Chair of the AITSL Board, members of the AITSL Board, but most importantly, the around 175 members of the HALT network, the nationally certified, highly accomplished and lead teachers who are gathered here today. And I am very delighted to be able to welcome you to open these couple of days' worth of proceedings. Just a couple of weeks ago, I joined the Prime Minister at a graduation ceremony hosted by the Smith family for some of their Learning for Life students in Melbourne. Students who come from very challenging circumstances, but with the helping hand of the Smith family, the dedication and commitment of teachers and schools have identified them as worthy of that helping hand, and they have accomplished and are achieving great and incredible things. We were delighted to be able to help the Smith family to extend their program, to do more with more families, and in doing so, to be able to ensure that you, teachers and schools, have that support that connects through to the home, to the family environment. And Malcolm told a story while he was giving his remarks to the students there. He spoke about his daughter Daisy, who was a teacher. And he said that recently he'd been walking through part of the electorate and he was stopped by somebody who said, "Prime Minister, excuse me, is your daughter Daisy?" And he said, yes. I'm thinking, where's this going to go? So I just wanted to tell you how much Daisy has changed the attitude and approach of my daughter to her education and to her schooling. And Malcolm went on to talk about, of course, the power and the impact that teachers have on individual lives and circumstances. And whilst attempting to think about my own teachers in that circumstance, what I actually thought of and recalled was growing up as a little boy when I lived for about 6 years with my grandmother. And she was a teacher. And we'd go along to the local supermarket. She'd just retired as I was living with her. But pretty much each trip to the supermarket took about twice as long as it needed to, as she was invariably stopped by parents of former students or former students themselves, thanking her, telling her stories, updating her. And for me, that is the powerful reminder of the impact that you and your colleagues all have. When I launched last year the inaugural Highly Accomplished and Lead Teacher Summit, I could see the enormous potential of this network, thanks to the combination of passion and skill that is amongst you, its members. I appreciate the personal commitment that you have shown in going through the certification process, the expertise and leadership that you bring to Australian schools, which is critical to continually lifting the quality and the professionalisation of teaching. I want to acknowledge particularly AITSL, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, for its work in creating real momentum for this network, which is just one example of the unique role that AITSL plays in supporting our teachers, leaders and school systems to strive for excellence. We all know that the key to achieving a high quality education system is in large part to continually improve teaching practice. But how do we go about that task? And some may ask, why do we need to? Data released over the last year shows that in some areas we are flatlining or struggling. Various comparative tests, and I know there are strong views that these tests don't and can't measure everything that matters in education, and I agree. But they do provide unique capacity to compare performance in some key skill areas across schools, across systems, across states and across countries. We should not ignore evidence that we may be slipping behind in some areas. Further, for the sake of Australia's future economic competitiveness, and therefore our standard of living and the standard of living of the students who you're teaching today in their future lives and of their children, we cannot afford to have anything but one of the great education systems in the world. We must also continually strive to improve teaching practice because, fairly or unfairly, society has come to expect schools and teachers to address more issues and to establish even richer skills in the students who you teach. The Australian Government is committed to striving for a high-quality school system that assists each and every Australian child to reach their full potential. This is why we're investing record amounts in schools. It's why that amount will continue to grow each year, above inflation, above enrolment levels, real per-student growth, maybe not as much as everyone would wish for, I acknowledge that, but real growth nonetheless, which will be distributed according to fair, needs-based principles. But funding formulas, and frankly policy documents developed in Canberra, are always going to be many steps removed from the classroom, which is where the real game in educational improvement happens. Many governments over many years have tried to effect change in this area, but often have done so without successfully harnessing the profession itself. That is exactly where this network of highly accomplished and lead teachers has an incredible opportunity to drive change. You are that link to the classrooms and schools right across Australia. As teachers working at the peak of your profession, you have a critical role to play. Highly skilled, exemplary teachers like yourselves can enhance the performance culture of the profession and encourage more effective teaching practice within your schools and networks. We know that will help all our students to do better. And it's with students in mind that I would encourage you all to take up the challenge of being an agent for change in your school and within your networks. Now, I think Renee's has been given a heads up that I was going to embarrass her this morning, which she probably hates, but I want to single out Renee's Lamont as an example of a teacher embracing the challenge of being an agent for change. Renee's is a nationally certified, highly accomplished teacher. She's also the 2016 Northern Territory Indigenous Educator of the Year, and for good reason. As well as teaching her own students at Casuarina Primary, Renee's found time to help other teachers improve their teaching methods and practices. Her principal, John Cleary, backed her to achieve certification. Then he leveraged her expertise to build teaching quality within the school and within surrounding schools. You'll hear more from Renee's and John later this morning, but I raise this as an example of the powerful change agent that a single teacher can be. In this case, Renee's was supported by her principal, demonstrating that great school leaders create the conditions where teachers can thrive and make a difference, not just in their classroom, but across their school and across the community of schools within which they live and work. One of the important characteristics that I've seen in the highly accomplished and lead teachers I've met is the setting of clear ambitions and high expectations for their students and the translation of this into teaching practice in their classrooms. This leads to real improvements in student outcomes, and teachers ought to be recognised and rewarded for this. I'm really pleased to see more and more teachers seeking certification at the highly accomplished and lead teacher levels. More than 350 teachers are now certified, and many have joined this HALT network. Each and every one of you is demonstrating the value of certification and connecting expert teachers with each other. As I said at this forum last year, I encourage employers to recognise this and reward it. I'm disappointed that not all states, territories or systems are on board in offering this pathway for their teachers to excel. Under the expert leadership of Professor Hattie and Lisa Rogers, our new CEO at AITSL, AITSL is doing a fantastic job promoting certification. AITSL's range of tools and resources is helping teachers and school leaders reflect on their practice. I was pleased to learn that the HALT network has contributed to these excellent resources, including the recently released My Induction app, which is proving immensely popular with around 1,800 downloads just in its first fortnight. I encourage you to read the paper developed by AITSL, together with certifying authorities, that presents a strategy to embed certification in our schooling system. Today I'm pleased to be here celebrating the launch of AITSL's vision for National Teacher Certification with the Taking the Lead paper. It offers a call to action for national certification as an option for teachers in all Australian schools. It outlines an approach to national certification which sets a rigorous, high bar and will raise the standing of the profession. It reaffirms that HALT teachers are essential to strengthening the profession. Our goal through AITSL is to boost the number of expert teachers and make it clear to the public that their expertise should be valued. Much of our reform agenda over recent years has been focused on ensuring the quality of initial teacher education. While initial teacher education has rightly been our focus, and there are certainly some reforms that still require implementation and follow-through, we must now sharpen our focus on the current teaching workforce. One of the major barriers to improvements is the availability of reliable data on the critical issue of teacher effectiveness or impact. Today I'm pleased to release a significant report, a research report prepared by the Melbourne Graduate School of Education entitled, a catchy title, Teacher Effectiveness Systems, Frameworks and Measures, a Review, bound to be a bestseller. But led by Professor Janet Clinton, it's an in-depth examination of approaches to teacher evaluation in a range of school systems around the world. We commissioned this report in April of last year. And while we know that teaching quality is the most important in-school factor affecting performance, we commissioned it because we don't really know how to measure impact or effectiveness. The report states, and I quote, "Current Australian evaluation systems appear to add little value to the enhancement of teaching practice, despite some recent support to develop career pathways for teachers. There also appears little capacity to evaluate teacher effectiveness at a local, state or national level. Hence, capacity building in the workforce is needed." Generally, when we talk about teacher quality, we're referring to capabilities, training and knowledge. Teacher effectiveness, on the other hand, refers to the extent to which a teacher is able to make a real difference to student outcomes, how to ensure the teaching practices deployed within a classroom over a term or a year ensure that each student learns or progresses to the maximum extent of their individual abilities. What is clear from the report is that Australia currently has no reliable, robust way of assessing teacher impact and effectiveness. But it's also clear that we're not alone in this challenge. Other countries are grappling with the same issue, and the report notes that no one country or state provides an exemplar of teacher evaluation systems or measures that are generally applicable to the Australian context. On the plus side, though, Australia has a good foundation with which to build this capacity, based on our teacher standards, the certification process and AITSL's track record of delivery. From these building blocks, we can shape teacher evaluation framework to build teachers in the continual improvement of their practice. Australia is well positioned to become a world leader in this area, and I hope that state and territory education ministers, the education community, including experts like all of you, will join us in coming months to talk about how we can develop a culture of defining and measuring teacher effectiveness in Australia. I intend to have this discussion with Professor Howdy at the Education Council to ensure all states and territories are united with us in efforts to help the profession to measure and therefore maximise effectiveness to achieve this significant and world-leading next step. It is not, however, an attempt to replicate or replace the appraisal, performance and development processes of employment conditions. It must be about enabling the profession itself to be its best, be owned by the profession itself in doing so, and help to ensure that teachers themselves have access to information on how effective they are and how it is they can increase their impact in the classroom. Developing a measurement of effectiveness will provide policymakers, school leaders, and most importantly teachers with a basis upon which to further improve their own professional development. I'm yet to meet a teacher who isn't driven by the desire to help each of their students to the maximum extent possible. If we can make this work, if we can make that happen, the implementation of that desire happen more often, then it will be a win for students who will learn more, teachers who will be more satisfied in the profession, schools who will be more highly regarded, and ultimately our nation, which will be more prosperous. In conclusion, I know that you all take seriously your obligation to continually improve your practice. For this, you have my admiration and appreciation. You, as individuals, have a critical role to play in being change agents in your schools and your networks, in also working together collaboratively to lift the standard, performance and professionalisation of all teachers. The obligation of your employers, state and territory governments and authorities across all school sectors and systems is to support you to drive improvement across all aspects of teaching. We need to give you clear guidance and support and practical resources so that with the help of your effective teaching, we can achieve what is together our shared ultimate goal, improving student outcomes. We need more people like all of you in the highly accomplished and lead teacher network. All state, territory and school sectors need to recognise and reward teachers performing at higher levels through the certification process, and this should happen now. We also need to listen to you. I invite you to share with me and encourage you to do likewise with my state and territory counterparts your considered opinions on how we can strengthen policies to support you to help our children achieve their best. Whether it is in curriculum content, discipline policies, parental engagement strategies, impactful programs, red tape reduction in schools, disability support, the most effective use of technology or any number of other areas, we should consider your ideas to ensure best practice teaching is accompanied by best practice policy. By developing, retaining and rewarding effective teachers, by harnessing your expertise and using evidence to guide us, I am confident that we can and will lift student outcomes. That confidence is absolutely reassured by seeing the enthusiasm and knowing of the commitment of the people in this room today, and by hearing from John as I entered how hard it is to contain the discussions when they get the likes of all of you together because of that passion and commitment and skill. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for what you bring. Thank you for the commitment you give, not just to the Holt network, but importantly across the profession, back in your communities. And I wish you every success with your discussions today and tomorrow, and most importantly, well into the future. Thanks so much. I look forward to some questions, I think.
Minister, do you have a couple of moments for some questions?
I do?
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Questions for the Minister?
Don't be timid.
You might get that off mic.
Your students, when I go into your classroom, certainly aren't when we go to questions.
Good morning, Simon. How are you?
G'day.
Look,
I wonder if you could stand up for us,
Oh,
if
yeah,
you don't mind.
Look, I just thought I'd ask you about STEM, but about the arts as well. So the focus of the government at present is funding for STEM subjects and STEM works. The arts also make a great contribution to student retention and wellbeing. Can we expect arts funding to become a priority for the government in the near future?
Look, my view is that that's where we have to make sure that the decisions that schools make in terms of how they balance the curriculum, how they balance cross-curriculum priorities are done in that school setting. That yes, we absolutely have been driving a focus on improving participation in STEM through school and beyond as a critical part of Australia's future, that around 70% of future jobs will require high levels of STEM skills, not STEM-specific jobs. We're not talking about lots of computer programmers, but that day-to-day jobs will require STEM skills in students when they go into the workforce in future, in some of those fastest growing categories. But I absolutely recognise that from an innovation perspective, creativity is a key part of driving that innovative culture and spirit. And so The arts is a driver of that creative thinking. As a standalone discipline, as a collaborative discipline undertaken with the STEM disciplines is an important part of that mix. That's, though, where we have to back teaching practice, schools in their decisions to make sure that internal resourcing and internal lesson structure brings all of that together. So understand what you're saying, and yes, there are a number of STEM-specific policies and programs that the Commonwealth's rolled out over the last couple of years, but in many of them I see no reason why they too shouldn't be able to collaborate with the arts disciplines too.
There's one just here, thank you. Would you introduce yourself as well, if that's
Certainly.
okay? Sorry.
Minister, thank you. I'm from Glen Innes High School in northern New South Wales. Name's Mercurius Goldstein. The region that we teach in, 5 of Australia's 10 lowest income postcodes are actually within a short drive of our school. And to your comments about funding formulas, what role do you see funding formulas playing in closing equity gaps within schooling, and the role of equity in general across Australia to lifting our performance, aside from the teacher effectiveness question?
Funding is one of those debates that is critically important and yet most frustrating simultaneously. Funding absolutely makes a difference. I know that it empowers what schools can do in their communities, but I also know that significant, lasting debt levels in our federal budget and so on are problems that today's students will have to deal with as tomorrow's employees and taxpayers, and that's not a fair legacy to leave either. So our challenge is to get that right, and that's why we absolutely commit to funding growth. And while I'm sure it's not the case in this room, it's surprised me at times in the job the extent to which some people think that there's a point at some point in the federal budget where funding is going backwards, going back to where it was a few years ago or something like that. And that's not the case. That's not the case at all. It absolutely keeps growing in the future, as I acknowledge. Not as fast as I'm sure many people in this room would like. And yeah, ideally, as Education Minister, I'd love to have an unlimited budget too. But unfortunately, I don't. With the budget I have that is growing, my determination is to make sure that we apply it in a way that is reflective of the needs-based principles that were contained in the Gonski report. That spent far more time, if you ever sat down and read the Gonski report from cover to cover, it spends far more time talking about how resourcing is allocated than it does necessarily about what the total sum of the pie necessarily is. And so I want to see us step through that. Now, of course, we have a historical arrangement in Australia where the Commonwealth has largely paid the predominant share of public funding that goes towards the non-government sector and a minority share of public funding that goes towards the government sector, and the states and territories do the inverse. That's not about to change, but we've certainly been increasing our share in the public sector, and again that will continue to grow in terms of the share of funding from the Commonwealth that goes into government schools will keep increasing into the future. With that, we're committed to making sure it's allocated from our perspective according to those needs-based principles. But it's important to appreciate that when it comes to actually being distributed to the schools, our funding formulas are notional, because we then give a lump sum to the state and territory in question, who then carve it up themselves. New South Wales does a pretty good job in terms of applying a formula nowadays that is not dissimilar to the one we're shifting to in Canberra in terms of those needs-based principles. And we won't shift away from that, and what we actually hope is that more of the states and territories will shift, like New South Wales, towards something that has that sort of transparency, has those loading factors applied for students of higher need from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, of indigeneity, of rural and regional issues, with disability, with non-English speaking backgrounds, all of those types of factors to be considered. So absolutely, from your type of perspective and from others who may be from lower SES schools or schools with particular challenges in the room, I'd say I really do want to make sure we have a lasting solution that provides a fair and equitable approach to distribution of that funding, but then of course also is embedded with clear processes to make sure we're utilising it as effectively as possible, which again is where the skills of people in a room like this come, in terms of your ability to be able to differentiate what is required in those schools that will receive the extra funding because they're of higher need, to make the difference in those schools, and what's the expert practice necessary there to make the real difference, because money will enable you to do it, but it doesn't actually do it itself.
Minister, I know that you are needing to head off, I think,
We can squeeze in one more, absolutely. That was a long answer, but I know it's a topic dear to probably many of your hearts.
Sir, my name's John Cole. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'll refer basically on the comments you were just talking about how it takes more than just money and more than just one program to make a difference. Can I, sir, just with respect ask that we don't rely on words like zero tolerance for bad behaviour? A lot of the schools I've worked in, those kids are coming to me, haven't slept on the lounge last night because mum's new boyfriend didn't want them sleeping in the house. They're eating whatever I bought them for breakfast because they didn't get a feed that night. I'll take the behaviour I get to get them at school, and saying things like zero tolerance looks a lot different in some schools, and I don't think labels like that really add to the sense of what these kids can do. Those kids are doing the best they can do with what they've got. I understand that there's a whole stack of, it takes a village to raise a child, but zero tolerance to bad behaviour, I'll take some behaviour if it gets those kids at school. Please, sir, just moderate your language on that.
Sure, John. Thanks, John, and I take the message in the spirit that you intended it. And look, a couple of quick points there, if I can. When I say that, I'm not meaning that I expect you to apply discipline strategies at the slightest sign of poor behaviour, but that absolutely, as I'm sure you do, that you don't necessarily tolerate bad behaviour, you try to influence it. And try to hopefully shift it to being less disruptive or causing fewer hassles. The totality of the remarks I made earlier this week were frankly largely more directed at the emphasis on the fact that we need to make sure and find ways where we can to bring families with us in terms of addressing some of the behavioural issues that I actually think too much of the load is expected to sit on the shoulders of teachers, principals and schools in dealing with behavioural issues. Now, there are circumstances like the one you gave that are real life circumstances for those kids and where nothing is necessarily going to change. But equally, without, thankfully, teachers caring like yourself. But equally, there are circumstances where families could do more to help make sure that there's a respectful attitude brought to school and not necessarily one where all of the load sits on the teachers themselves. So I think it's a real issue that the evidence does show we need to accept, acknowledge and address. I don't come with magic answers or solutions. You guys would have far more of those than I do for the strategies and the policies there. But particularly, and I mentioned it in terms of the long shopping list of areas where your feedback on policies is important. If in your schools you believe that the policy settings you're working under don't enable you to effectively deal with some of those behavioural issues as well as you otherwise could, then that's something we need to hear, and something I'm happy to hear and to take up with the states and territories who set those policies to be able to help make sure that you have all the resources at your disposal. In terms of families, well, the best engagement strategies that you know of are things that we should encourage to be shared around the sector. Look, I know this is probably the most difficult issue that many of you deal with in terms of kids coming from sometimes terrible circumstances of the home environment, and school is the most, sometimes the only normal thing in their lives, and that you are a real buffer around them in that regard. But we also need to address those issues, and address those issues particularly where we should be helping families to do better, to instil respectful behaviours, attitudes and relationships to get the best outcomes in your classroom for those kids themselves and those who are sitting around them.
Okay, thank you, Minister.
Thanks,
On
Lisa.
behalf of us all, we appreciate your time and we'll keep you posted as to how we go.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks very much. Good luck.